Hello, and welcome to the Alpha Male Podcast, the podcast where we talk about what it means to be a man, made in the image of God, strong, dominant, and in control, and we don't apologize for it. Today, we're going to be talking about 9/11, and by God's grace, this podcast will come out tomorrow. Now, I was not originally planning on doing a podcast about September 11th on September 11th, but it seemed fitting. Now, if you've listened to the bio before or you're about to listen to it, you might surmise from that event had a rather large impact on the rest of my adult life. Well, we'll get into that in the main topic. I'll plug in the bio. You want to skip it? Skip around 3 minutes and 45 seconds, and we'll get into the topic. Who am I? A question we should all ask ourselves. I am, first and foremost, a servant of God, made in His very own image, a follower of Jesus Christ. A simple man called by God to the Great Commission to share the good news of Jesus Christ. Next, a little bit about my background and what God has allowed me to do and blessed me to do in life. Grew up what most would consider very poor in the backwoods of the southeastern and mid-Atlantic United States, hunting and fishing. Joined the Marine Corps at 17. Did a couple of combat tours in Iraq. So a decorated Marine Corps combat veteran. Infantry assaultman. After the combat tours, I was an urban warfare instructor for the United States Marine Corps under Mojave Viper. I also served in the U.S. Army, both full-time and part-time National Guard. Also a veteran of law enforcement. I served with LAPD. I was a sworn peace officer, a cop for LAPD. I worked regular patrol assignments and more specialized assignments. One of those more specialized assignments was warrant service, fugitive recovery. Also had some other law enforcement roles. I am an FBI certified firearms instructor and been certified by another 3-letter government agency in a lot of firearms and training things. I've also been a private contractor, worked in the private sector pertaining to tactics and gunfighting and protecting America from enemies foreign and domestic. I served as the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters in a large metropolitan area. That was our primary mission, to stop active shooters, which sadly are a thing in America today. I've also been blessed to do quite a bit of competition shooting. Started my first formal competitions even before joining the Marine Corps at 17. I had won more shooting competitions than I can remember. I have competed in all manner of disciplines in shooting. I've been blessed to be a state rifle and pistol champion, West Coast regional champion. Like I said, been blessed to win more shooting competitions than I can remember. Mentioned hunting. I've hunted to put meat on the table starting when I was a child. I've also been a professional big game hunter and guide, hunting and slaying all manner of beast. And I don't apologize for that. Humbled to be the host of 3 podcasts. Simple Man Sermons, Alpha Male Podcast, and Gunfighter Life. Obviously, as things not mentioned, I've been blessed to do many other things. But, again, first and foremost, I'm a servant of God, a believer and follower of the Bible, the Word, Jesus Christ. and I don't apologize for that. With that, let's transition into today's topic. September 11th, 2001. That day started for me much like many other days. Now for me, I joined the Marine Corps. I enlisted already. I was in my 4th year of JROTC. I had already enlisted in the Marine Corps, but I was waiting to get my last credits finished up in high school to graduate high school before I actually shipped out to boot camp. What's called delayed entry, where I joined at 17, but I had to graduate high school first. But I was already in the Marine Corps, was already waiting to ship out a couple of days after I graduated. By that time, it was peacetime, and it had been for quite a while, since the Gulf War. Well, September 11th, 2001, started like any other day for me, and like most other people in America. I was in Spanish class, the class I happened to be in when we got the news that planes were flying into the World Trade Center. I remember that. Likely, you all listening, if you're old enough to, remember where you were on September 11th, 2001. And why do you remember? Because it's one of those seminal moments that changed the world that we live in, that shaped it. The world is different post 9/11 than pre 9/11. Pre 9/11, there had been plenty of hijackings. Usually, airlines were hijacked for money, for ransom. They were safely landed. Planes returned. People got off. That was the hijackings, again, weren't new in 2001. Radical Muslim Islamic terrorists really brought terrorism to our front door. They literally flew it and smashed it in front of our faces that day. And we realized that terrorism was a part of our life now. Before that, I do believe you could just buy an airline ticket in cash and walk on a plane. Well, anybody that's flown anytime since then, especially recently, will tell you that's not the case anymore. Long-lasting repercussions of September 11th. If you listen to the bio, you know that I did in fact go to boot camp, graduate, become a United States Marine, infantry assaultman. I did ship out and waited for the war to start in Iraq. I also served in the U.S. Army, both full-time and part-time National Guard. After my combat tours in the Marine Corps, I was an urban warfare instructor, a private contractor, commander of a tactical team, and that all kind of ties into that war on terror, that war that started on September 11th, 2001. I lost a real good friend in Iraq, and lots of good young men were lost. But, we were tight. We hung out on the weekends. We weren't just in a unit together, which in and of itself is a bond, but we chose to spend our spare time together as well. There was a small group of us that would try and escape that horrible base we were stationed on when we were stateside, which is 29 Palms, and get out. We were stuck on base. Maybe we would get together and watch some horrible 80s movies and get Domino's pizza. Neil Pesci was a good friend, and he died in the sands of Iraq because we were at war. And let's not forget that we're still at war. Neil Pesci, his sacrifice, like the thousands of other young men that died in those desert sands, on those far-flung pieces of dirt of Iraq and Afghanistan, because of these hijacked planes on September 11th. To say nothing of the countless thousands of veterans that came home with PTSD, but later took their own lives because they had such a hard time with what they had seen or what they had done or adjusting back to. For whatever reason, I'm not here to judge that. There's a reason I started out with my late friend's name. They say that, one death is a tragedy, but 1,000,000 is a statistic. I forget who said that, but if I just say numbers, how many thousands of young men have died and are still dying in the war on terror, how many veterans have committed suicide and are still committing suicide as a result of the things that they had to do or see or witness or be a party to in the war on terror. It might not mean a whole lot. It would just be a statistic. But think about a brave young warrior growing up in America, in a very privileged, very wealthy society with so many opportunities, and deciding to sign that dotted line and go live in a hole in the ground in a far-flung desert overseas to be shot at and hot and dirty and perhaps have to do or see horrible, unspeakable things and put his life on the line. And how many individual personalities, individual souls of young men went off to fight that war on terror that never came back or never came back the same. I can say I don't know of any combat veteran. I speak as a man who went to war twice in Iraq, that I don't know that you can ever go to war and come back the same. And I don't want to just make this American-centric. It impacted the world as a whole. It certainly impacted us because we sent men over to Iraq, but I served with other nations over there. I remember serving with Spaniards and Brits and El Salvadorians and Koreans. And that's just our side. As I mentioned, I was in Kuwait waiting for the war to start. And I don't know how to quantify this or verify this, but I believe from what we were told, we were like one of the very first units, if not the very first ground unit over the line into the invasion of Iraq. And I was blessed with a kind of special look when we got to Baghdad. I was kind of part of a special assignment, an advanced detachment, apart from the regular infantry attached to some other people. That's really all I'll say, but we had a safe house set up in Baghdad, operating in there, much more of a covert role. And that gave me a very unique look at Baghdad, the capital, giant metropolitan, modern city. I got to see it pre-collapse, and I got to see it descend into chaos. A fairly modern city with, women walking around in Western-style clothing, and a Christian sector and a Jewish sector. In fact, if I remember correctly, our neighbors were British, or used to be British, and now were Iraq citizens. I remember playing soccer out in the street with the kids. And I got to see that city destroyed, descending into chaos from a first-rate modern city, a war-torn, hollow remnant of its former self. I got to see buildings topple and regimes fall. And I sadly saw more death than any man ought to see. Before, when I was back to that pre-9/11, that day I joined the Marine Corps, I thought, being a young man, that war would be glorious. It would be a grand adventure to go and fight a war. And so, naive, younger me thought that it was pretty cool that had happened, that I would be going to war to fight for my country. But war is always horrible, and the things that I saw over there, they were horrible. Again, I saw more death than I care to remember. Just fields of death and destruction when that city was destroyed, liberated, whatever you want to call it. For whatever reason, for whatever political things that were far above my pay grade, as we say in the military. Those were a result of that day, September 11th, 2001. Many generations have days that change the world pre- and post-event. Now you could make a logical linear progression backwards. I guess that'd be a regression. But anyway, to say that the war started long before that during the Cold War with us and the Russians in Afghanistan and then pulling back and abandoning and all that region. And anyway, that's beside the scope of today's topic. Much like the war drums were being beaten for us to join World War II, pretty clearly we entered World War II. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. And pretty clearly, the War on Terror started not just for us, but for many other nations, and for the civilians, the farmers of the nations of Iraq and Afghanistan. On September 11th, 2001. A lot of lives were lost that day. A lot of lives have been lost and are being lost up until this day because of what happened that day. For that reason, I thought it was worth speaking to you today. Now, a lot of men listening to this podcast, I believe from what I know, are veterans. And it obviously has impacted us. The War on Terror obviously defined our time in the military. Much that's changed. When I joined, still polished our boots and ironed our uniform and wore the old woodland camo. We didn't even carry tourniquets. IED, improvised explosive device, was not really a thing we were acquainted with or trained for or studied for or anything like that. When I joined the Marine Corps, we were very much into that Cold War, getting geared up to fight a uniformed enemy on a well-defined battlefield with tanks and artillery and an American rifleman with an M16 versus a Soviet comrade with an AK-47. And we had trained for that, and we were training for that war that never happened for a long time. We never got that war. We got a different war. Different enemy, a less well-defined, radical, extremist, terrorist, ununiformed, guerrilla enemy, not defined by another nation state or a uniform or any kind of ensign or banner or battle flag, but by a radical ideology and a hatred for America and a Western way of life and values. And that enemy still exists. There's still plenty of those out there that still hate us, to put it bluntly. Whether the War on Terror made that better or worse, it's not my place to judge. A soldier's place is not to question why. And let's not forget that, because we've recently had another pivotal moment. I'd say worldwide this time. COVID-19. The world is a far different place post-COVID versus pre-COVID. Likely many will remember their time during COVID. I again had a very unique look at this because, unlike most people, I continued to work. I was the commander of a tactical team in a large city to stop active shooters. And you might think I'd be out of a job because there's not a lot of active shooters when there's not a lot of people in big cities doing big events. But I kept my job because what there was looting and rioting and things like that. And I got to see a very unique look at a city abandoned. Got to see giant buildings with acres and acres and acres of space empty and void of humans. Like some kind of post-apocalyptic dreamland with no people and no interaction. I got to see animals so accustomed to eating people's trash, and there was no people, so there was no trash, that they were just emaciated and starved and following you around, hoping that you would give them something to eat. I got to see, in a very short period of time, a city that was so vibrant and full of the hustle and bustle and noise and commerce of a big metropolitan area, to quiet, abandonment for some time. Now, I'm accustomed to solitude in the wilderness and the woods, but it's a strange thing to have solitude in giant urban jungles, in giant skyscrapers, in giant venues, where the lights still flash on and off, and there's some creaking and groaning of mechanical things, but almost no other humans around. But that wasn't normal. Most of you have a far different remembrance of COVID-19. You remember being stuck at home, which, I'll be honest, probably would have been harder for me. You remember being stuck at home, not being able to leave an apartment. Crazy, hoarding of toilet paper and all manner of things. It was it was an event that really hadn't ever been seen before. And likely people will remember that for the rest of their lives if they're old enough to remember and comprehend it, much like 9/11. We're still seeing the effects of that now. And I won't get into politics or anything like that. I want the show to be better than that and to be more than that. But likely the ramifications of COVID are still being felt now, and who knows for how long and how long-lasting those effects will be. Much like suicide is a big problem among veterans. I heard that suicide was a big thing for people during COVID. Hopefully that's gotten better. And there's no denying there's probably has been and will continue to be for some time some economic effects, for whatever reason, related to COVID-19. What are some lessons? What's the point? Well, I'd say a big one is that nobody knew, aside from a few terrorists, maybe their handlers overseas, on September 10th, that the world was going to change that day. Nobody knew on September 10th, again, outside those handful of people. But the world did change, whether they were ready and expecting it or not. So watch and be ready. You don't know when it's going to be. You don't know when that next pivotal thing is going to happen, when it's going to happen, or what it's going to be. A pandemic, a shutdown, a terrorist attack. You don't know when. You don't get to pick. You don't know where. You don't know what. So watch and be ready. Whatever times they are. There's a time for peace and a time for war. Whatever time, whatever season, whether wartime or peacetime, whether abased or abounding in life, it's always right and it's always good and it's always the right answer to turn to God. So, for me, those are things that I can glean from those two events. With that, men, thanks for listening to the Alpha Male Podcast. No tactical tip of the day. Your tactical verse of the day I find fitting from Ecclesiastes. It's the book in most of your Bibles after Psalms and Proverbs. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to gain, and a time to lose, a time to keep, and a time to throw away, a time to tear, and a time to sow, a time to keep silent, and a time to speak, a time to love, and a time to hate, a time of war, and a time of peace. With that, men, thanks for listening. Be strong. Have a blessed day.